You have asked me first, are artists free to represent the world in whatever ways they see fit? The short answer is yes. They are free within the limits of their own personal abilities and to the extent that they can count on the protection and patronage of the state, and in our capitalist society, on the stimulus of a reasonably active marketplace. So you can see I've already got three things going on now. We've got the protection of the state, we've got the stimulus of a marketplace, and we have the limitations of their own ability. Let me elaborate. I'll begin by identifying four kinds of freedom that artists may or may not enjoy, and in Canada do enjoy to a remarkable degree. These four freedoms bleed into each other and play off against each other to some extent, but it is useful to consider them separately. Artists enjoy, first, imaginative or intellectual freedom, the freedom of the mind to explore in a society that offers a considerable degree of innovative stimulus. 2, economic freedom, the freedom to engage with the local and global marketplace and to receive public support. 3, legal freedom, guaranteed but also circumscribed, most notably through the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And 4, ethical freedom, the freedom and opportunity to express opinions through their art freely within a public space. Linking these four kinds of freedom are two principal lines of tension crossing the public-private divide. The first tension is between imaginative freedom, which is private, and legal freedom, which is public, and has to do with standards, with determining what is or is not a transgression of accepted social norms. Contemporary Western society enjoys an unprecedented degree of openness to the world, and this openness, while it is a wonderful stimulus to the creative imagination, also offers artists plenty of rope with which to entangle themselves. As any psychiatrist can affirm, the imagination can be a dangerous place. The principal flashpoints for confrontation over the freedom of the creative imagination are sex, religion, and politics, or obscenity, blasphemy, and sedition in their transgressive forms. Freedom of imaginative or artistic expression enjoys strong guarantees within our legal system, both generally through the Charter's guarantee of freedom of expression and specifically in the criminal code through what used to be known as the, quote, artistic merit defense. The ready availability of the Internet as a dissemination and marketing tool for child pornography has brought increased attention to this area of the law. A key case in the evolution of the artistic merit defense was Regina versus Sharp in 2000, and some of you may remember this from the newspapers. Sharp, an alleged pedophile, was acquitted of pornography charges related to his personal writings, entitled, provocatively enough, Kitty Kink Classics, on the grounds of artistic merit, but found guilty of 2 counts of illegal possession and of possession for the purposes of distribution or sale of pornographic pictures of children under the age of 14 engaged in sex. I should point out that despite the use of the so-called artistic merit defense, Mr. Sharp did not receive any public funding from any arts supporting body in the country and was not a published author. Parliament responded by passing an amendment to the Criminal Code in 2005, making mere possession an indictable offense and narrowing the permissible defense not any longer to the so-called artistic merit defense, but a defense related to, quote, having a legitimate purpose related to art. This, believe me, was a very controversial move within the arts community of this country. This tension between complete imaginative freedom and standards of public decency sets the lower limit in response to part 2 of your question, are artists answerable for their views, and to whom? They are answerable to the courts, which rule on behalf of society. Social norms, however, change. The justice system shifts in response. Obscenity, blasphemy, and sedition are never immutably and eternally defined. The change in accepted norms of moral behavior over the past half-century has in fact been remarkable. With respect to obscenity and child pornography, the change has been driven more by advertising than by art. The drive to sell, and what more powerful selling tool can there be than sex, has trumped traditional standards of public decency. Artists accused of obscenity, even though their work is ultimately exonerated, may suffer by their exposure to the judicial process, as innocent victims may in encounters with other aspects of the law. Again, I point out innocent victims. A notable case was that of Eli Langer in 1993, whose sexually ambiguous paintings and drawings were confiscated by the Toronto Police from the Mercer Union Gallery. In the ensuing court case, distinguished artists and curators testified persuasively to the work's artistic merit, and the work was ultimately returned to the artist. But he has worked strictly in the realm of abstract painting ever since. The second line of tension links the marketplace and the public realm and has to do with values. Is there a kind of artistic activity that, while it cannot survive on the support of the marketplace alone, that is, it has limited commercial value, is of a degree of excellence and public benefit such that it deserves to be supported by the state, that is, has significant intrinsic value? This is, of course, not strictly an either-or situation. A work can have both an intrinsic and a market value. People do, after all, pay for their theater tickets. Nonetheless, this line of tension marks an upper limit to the question, to whom is the artist answerable? Artists driven to pursue a kind of excellence defined by intrinsic value are answerable to their own sense of moral and aesthetic rightness, to their muse, to use an old-fashioned term, or in more contemporary terms, to the inner authenticity of their personal creative vision. As McGill philosopher Charles Taylor put it in Sources of the Self, unlike previous conceptions of moral sources in nature and God, modern views give a crucial place to our own inner powers of constructing or transfiguring or interpreting the world. To your second question, should publicly funded art reflect an official understanding of local or national culture? The short answer is no. That no is given teeth in the case of the Canada Council, which I head, by the principle of arm's length, which is the guiding principle underlying the operations of Canada's crown corporations, and in particular its cultural crown corporations. Because this is a principle that in my day-to-day work I see being applied practically across a wide spectrum of operations, I want to postpone an elaboration of that short answer while I give you a quick thumbnail sketch of how the Canada Council is structured and how it conducts its business. The Canada Council for the Arts is the principal federal organ of state support for the arts. The principal federal organ of state support for the arts. I stress that it is a state apparatus because there is an important distinction between state and government. The business of the state, as represented by the Queen and the Governor-General, the Crown, is to sustain our institutions and give them functioning and keep them functioning as they should over the long term. The business of government, which changes at roughly 4-year intervals through the election process, is shorter term. It is to steer the state, making repairs and introducing reforms by developing and implementing policy and programs. As a Crown corporation, the Canada Council for the Arts belongs to the apparatus of the state. It maintains an arm's-length relationship with government that guarantees a degree of independence, and also guarantees that the government is not obliged to accept responsibility for the Council's activities, as it is in the case of the activities of its own departments. As a Crown corporation, the Canada Council reports to Parliament as a whole, not to a specific government, through but not to a minister. Its board members are appointed by the Governor and Council, the Governor-General acting on the advice of her ministers at the point where state and government meet. Crown corporations arose early in the 20th century from the recognition that in a large country with a small population, there are gaps that society and private enterprise alone cannot fill, but where direct and sustained government involvement is not desirable. The first Canadian Crown corporation was a railway network, the CNR. But the advantage of this institutional model in the cultural arena, where intrinsic value may take precedence over commercial value, was quickly recognized. I do not want to sound naive. Situations change, and because of the growing sophistication of civil society, some gaps are being closed up. The resultant tendency over the past 2 or 3 decades has been for Crown corporations either to be privatized or to come under closer government control. The government also maintains a variety of powers to influence their operations, including the ability to amend legislation and the authority to make key appointments and to approve and guarantee funding. In the cultural sphere, the Crown corporation model has worked particularly well at the federal level, and the principle of arm's length has been generally respected. Buttressed with this guarantee of independence, Canada's cultural Crown corporations, including the Canada Council for the Arts, the CBC, the National Arts Centre, the National Gallery, among others, have been a sustaining voice behind the striking chorus of authentic Canadian voices as our artists contribute their many local perceptions to the shaping of our increasingly global culture. The cultural Crown corporations defend and support our artists, giving resonance to their voices and helping them to communicate their vision to a worldwide public. Inuit filmmaker Zacharias Kunuk, director of the prize-winning film Atanarjuat, The Fast Runner, put it simply, and I quote, "With Canada Council financing and video as our tool, we have been able to record and save our culture." At the time of its win at Cannes and at numerous other film festivals, Atanarjuat, the world's first Inuit-made feature film, was playing in over 40 Paris cinemas. With that as background, let us return to the question, should publicly funded art reflect an official understanding of local or national culture? The answer, as I said before, is a resounding no. This question has a faint odor of totalitarian brimstone that is completely incongruous with conditions in our very open, pluralistic, and politically decentralized society. So let me rip into it. For publicly funded art to reflect an official understanding of culture, there has to be an official understanding of culture. A quick reading of Hansard will make it clear that while there is a variety of opinion on any specific culture-related issue, there is nothing coherent or broad-based enough to be graced with the name of an official understanding of culture. in our geographically, politically, socially, linguistically, and economically decentralized federation, where education is a provincial jurisdiction, it seems highly unlikely that an official understanding of culture could either take root or be imposed. The most significant policy document on culture that Canada has produced was the report of the Royal Commission on National Development in the Arts, Letters and Sciences, the so-called Massey Report, in 1951. It was an excellent and ultimately effective document, and the establishment of the Canada Council as an arm's-length body was one of its main recommendations. It underlined the importance of shielding the arts and academic research from political interference. In praising the model of the Arts Council of Great Britain, the report quoted a passage from the inaugural address of that council's first chairman, John Maynard Keynes. Quote, "The task of an official body is not to teach or to censor, but to give courage, confidence, and opportunity." If an official understanding of culture is not the basis for the public funding of art, there must nonetheless be some kind of common understanding as the basis for administering a granting body. The Canada Council continues to develop that understanding through an extensive peer assessment system, relying on the collective wisdom of a large pool of peers that is constantly being extended and renewed. About 800 peers, drawn from every region of Canada in every art form, served on council juries last year alone. Because of our restriction that juror members cannot serve again for another 24 months, that means that every 2 years, approximately 1,600 of these peers, that is, practicing artists or professionals in the arts sector, serve in making the decisions of who and which organizations will receive funding from the public purse at the federal level through the Canada Council for the Arts. We also keep an eye on audiences. The Canada Council is a minority investor in virtually all of the arts organizations it supports. Among the larger performing arts organizations, council funding averages only 7% of total revenue. Ticket sales, on the other hand, average between 40 and 50% for those organizations. If arts organizations cannot maintain the support of an audience, not necessarily a mass audience, but a committed and constant audience, or if they slip into prolonged deficit, it is unlikely they will continue to receive the support of Canada Council funding. Grants to organizations, about 2,000 of them annually, account for almost 85% of the Council's total grants budget. And our total grants budget this year is approximately $150 million. Far from encouraging artists and arts organizations to reflect an official understanding of culture, public funding should, in the best of all possible worlds, be a tool permitting artists to develop and express their creative imagination and the public to arrive freely at a broader, deeper, and more complex understanding of the way in which Canada's particularly artistic voices contribute to the global chorus. Public funding should be, and in Canada is, not a coercive force, but a permissive one, opening and illuminating opportunities. Now for the third question. Does art have a social or political function? Should it? There can be no doubt that art exercises a persuasive or engaging force. The remark, "that leaves me cold," being the ultimate dismissal of a work that has failed to stir its audience. Nor can there be any doubt that the expressive or persuasive force of art may be, and throughout history frequently has been, applied to social and political ends, and indeed religious ends, whether at the behest of the artist himself or at that of his patron, institutional or private. I would be willing to hazard a guess that over the long reach of history, art's public function, whether social, political, or religious, has outshone and outweighed its private, purely personal, or perhaps familial one. The question, therefore, of whether art in general should have a social or political function is almost beside the point, akin to asking, should cars have wheels? The question that must be asked repeatedly and with some vigilance is whether in a particular set of circumstances art is being put to an improper use. And if there is abuse, what is the nature of the abuse? And what are the mitigating factors? And where does responsibility lie for addressing the issue? Here I am thinking particularly of questions of intellectual property right, which have been given urgency by the rapid development of information technology. Where should the limits of the public domain be staked out? How porous should this border be? What ethical right does the artist have to determine the uses to which his work will be put? What commercial right does he have to a share of any profits ensuing from the use or enjoyment of his work? Who in a global world can enforce this right? Another legitimate area of concern is the phenomenon of political correctness. A culture of political correctness can be a real barrier to the kind of intense and open critical discussion that is a spur to the development of both the artist's imagination and the public's apprehension and understanding of a work of art. Because a culture of political correctness is so self-censoring, it tends to go publicly unchallenged. It is a kind of passive egalitarianism taken to an extreme, the outgrowth of a pluralist society in which no system of values is accepted as distinctly true or good, and rather negatively conceived group rights to freedom from proliferate. Artistic freedom must be an active freedom, freedom to, not freedom from, or we are left with only a blandly correct niceness, inauthentic, and hollow at the core. Which brings me to your fourth and final question. What are the social costs of artistic freedom? What are the costs of its lack? Whatever the social costs of artistic freedom may be, they are far outweighed by its benefits. In encouraging the free expression of our artists, our tax dollars are well spent. The fundamental social cost of artistic freedom is that some people are going to be perplexed or offended. Established or conventional ways of thinking will be disturbed. Nothing can be taken for granted or swept under the rug. Artistic freedom introduces an element of social and political discomfort. But the payoff is in dynamism, a constructive tension, a healthy dialectic. The arts in their many forms both share in and contribute to the vibrancy and openness of our democratic society. They celebrate, they challenge, they inform, they question, they enlighten, and they delight. Sometimes they also offend, and sometimes they bore. They are free to do that too. It puts the rest in perspective and forces us to make critical judgments. Not every finished work of art is defensible, but what must ultimately be defended are the freedom of the maker to take risks and work from the heart, and the freedom of every individual, audience member, reader, listener, viewer, to endorse the work or not. Ultimately, the great benefit of artistic freedom to society is that it intensifies and broadens human communication. It fosters authenticity and relevancy. It keeps us open, and it keeps us honest. Thank you very much.
Okay. In the middle of Halifax is the Common. Many of you are familiar with the Common. It's a common, it was founded hundreds of years ago as a common grazing area for the settlers of Halifax at the time to bring their cows and their goats and their sheep. As a common grazing area, there was a law protecting this right of the goat herds and whatnot to use it. And this law stayed on the books in Halifax long after the last goat and the last cow had left the Common. It's kind of a kooky law. But I mention it as an example of a situation where a law it wasn't helping the goat herds, and protecting something is not the same as encouraging it. Laws for free expression are great, but having good laws in a country is not the goal. The goal should be an art-infused society that supports and values and concerns itself with culture in all its forms. Music, film, visual arts, the written word, digital mashups. Society is improved by the very existence of cultural production. I can't even explain why. It needs explanation. It just is. It's a wonderful thing for society. You notice it. You notice a vitality and a spirit when you travel to a culturally rich place. And unless you're from maybe Toronto or Montreal, when you return to Canada from one of these culturally rich places, you feel a little bit hollow, and you're aware of a great unrealized potential. So, what is it that impedes active artistic expression in Canada? I think there's several things that get in the way to greater and lesser degrees. One of the first is government. And Bob, I appreciate your distinction between government and the state. So we're talking government actually here as distinct from the state. In my experience, there's a tendency in government to treat the rights of artistic expression as less important than other rights. Just one example, since my time's going. Lila Rai, people here might remember, a video artist. 5 years ago, she had produced a loop of a 12-second video of her and her baby daughter singing into each other's mouths. This was looping on a big TV screen in the front window of a gallery on Barrington Street, the Eye Level Gallery. So I guess it caused someone to think maybe this was some sort of child pornography, or there was some sort of exploitation, there was some sort of sexual element here. I don't know exactly what was going on in this person's head, but she called somebody, and soon enough the police were down at the gallery, and they had seized the video and took it away for examining and trying to figure out if they would charge Lila Rai with anything. Now, I'm not sure why the rights of some busybody to make a phone call trump the rights of expression, but they did. One of the other things that impedes cultural creation in Canada is a copyright law. Bob touched on this a little bit. Computers now and the spread of the internet and internet tools make the tools for the creation and dissemination of culture are incredibly powerful right now, especially when people take one piece of content and another and mix them together and create something new. I mean, that is art. Borrowing from one piece of art and adding your twist to it and making something new, famously is art, historically is art. But today, major corporate interests want to stop cultural consumers from also being cultural creators. They like it a one-way street where people are just consuming, paying for the culture, and not using these tools to unleash the creativity, which is as close as a mouse. Coupled with copyright restrictions, we're talking internet tools, so that is affecting young people especially. That is only part of a general anti-youth sentiment in society, I see, around youth expression. Graffiti artists, for example, are hounded by law instead of celebrated for creating free art for all of us to enjoy on the street. In Halifax, at the Halifax Regional School Board, internet access is limited students there. Plenty of websites, including the coasts, are unavailable for students to use. So that's just a whole realm of culture, and then in return, a way for them to express themselves is just limited to them, just because I guess they're young and people in power know better. But these problems, these little problems, pale beside the larger obstacle to artistic expression in Canada, which is, of course, there's not enough of a market for arts in this country. Now, I'm not saying the Canada Council needs more money. Cultural appreciation coming down from the top is not the way to widely affect society. It needs to come from public pressure to support and encourage art, from the public creating a demand for artists to use the freedom protected by law, to stimulate the sort of creation that makes society so vital. Now, government does have a role to play here. As messy as it can get when government is involved in arts creation or appreciation, which I think government should stay far away from, government can legislate demand for art. For instance, government, every level of government could require that public property be used to encourage public art. The ground floor of every public building could dedicate a set of its space, a certain amount of its space to being an art gallery. Public parks, a certain amount of the land in public parks should perhaps be devoted to public art. That would create a real demand, obviously. Government already spends some of its money on cultural products, but it could get better at finding opportunities to spend on local artists. A couple insane examples. At Nova Scotia Tourism, when you phone their information line, if you get put on hold, the music you hear is just Muzak, just crappy Muzak from some American corporation that they're just paying a licensing fee for. This is in a province that markets Celtic local culture and music as a tourism selling tool. They don't even give you any when you're on hold. It's not $150 million, but Halifax is putting $150,000 into Celine Dion's concert next August. I mean, how many years of an artist's life could you buy? I mean, ideally only one. That'd be great if an artist was paid $150,000, but I mean, realistically, you could buy an artist for 10 years for $150,000. Anyway, the opportunities to add culturally to public space are literally limitless if you're looking. Barcelona, beautiful city, the sidewalks there are tiled with art. The sidewalk tiles in Barcelona are art. That is literally grassroots or concrete roots support for their culture. And in Canada, people have too much freedom to avoid art. Cultural appreciation needs to start young if it's going to eventually start to matter. Music and arts are the first things that are cut from schools. This is teaching that culture is not important. If you teach the kids that culture is not important, this risks being a lifelong lesson, and that's going to hurt society. Running out of time. I'm not advocating a culture supported exclusively by state and or government. It's hard to imagine state support ever being widely sustainable on a scale that would change the country, change the spirit and vitality of the country. I would prefer, instead of seeing the support coming down from the top, I'd see the support coming from the bottom up, from the people up. Once we've nurtured a society that values its own culture, the public will start demanding its culture, creating a pull on government, the state, business to support art. Really simple example, lawyers' offices in this country have horrible art on the walls. In Barcelona, I don't think people would stand for it. You get a different lawyer. If the public starts demanding it, it just creates a market, which in turn allows more people to afford to be free to create. Culture is integral to the social fabric. A lot of what we're talking about tonight, a lot of my examples, it's not the cultural fabric, they're just stitches. The Black Santa controversy, that's a difficult stitch. The Lila Rye video and the police confiscating that's a bad stitch. Canada Council grants, that's a positive stitch. laws for free expression, those are good stitches. But I fear that's all we've got, some random stitches. Society needs something more substantial. Society really needs a cultural fabric. Something that could be a quilt, or a trampoline, or an umbrella. Something that can be ripped and mended and added to without fear it will disappear.
And I'm the working artist on the panel, and I can only speak from that perspective, so I just want to make it clear I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of all artists or as some sort of expert on artistic freedom of expression. But to the first question, are artists free to represent the world in whatever way they see it? Well, not in every case, but in many cases. Part of the job description of the artist is to be the outsider, someone who takes distance between themselves and the world in order to be able to view it, analyze it, and send back what they see in a creative format. Essentially, the art an artist makes is the artist saying, to me, life, or a particular aspect of life, is like this. This mirroring of what the artist sees in society is not an objective mirror. It's filtered through the artist's vision, and this is a combination of talent, perspective, and craft. So being lucky enough to live in Canada, unlike some other parts of the world, yes, I guess I, as an individual artist, do feel free to represent the world in the way I see it, within limits, of course, which I'll touch on briefly in the next question. And with my eyes wide open that artists and art have had a long history of controversy, and that the artist has to be prepared for, or at least not terribly surprised by, whatever opposition might come their way. Of course, some artists intentionally court controversy, and others merely find their work in the middle of it. But in every case, any case, not everyone is going to agree with your point of view and your creative manifestation of it. Your art will be art to some, an exercise that cultivates indifference in others, and in some cases, to some people, it might be evidence of the sky is falling and what have we come to. So the second question, are artists answerable to their views, and if so, to whom? Well, yes, I do think artists are answerable to their views. First and foremost, like Bob Sermon said, they're answerable to themselves and their personal standards for artistic merit. Marcel Duchamp said, art is what you call it, but art is also a craft. And like any craft, the artist should hope to apply some professional standards. If you eschew craft, then you might hit one out of the ballpark as a gift from the god of inspiration. But if you rely solely on this method, that means more often than not, you'll probably end up with poorly executed art, which is not a crime, of course, just a shame. So as I said before, part of being an artist is to mirror back to society your interpretation of what you see, and so the onus is on the artist to tell the truth as they see it. Truth, of course, is as much a difficult word to define as art is, and in this case, I don't mean to say that an artist's truth is objective so much as it is, or should be, true to how the individual artist sees the world. And this part of the job is what often gets the artist in trouble with the world at large. Though not a prerequisite for every artist, one of art's optional functions, which somewhat answers should art have a political or social function, is to work as a social critic, taking what you see as accepted to be true in society and holding it up for analysis, and in some cases, debunking. This role can be intentionally or unintentionally assumed by the artist. And I have to say, it never ceases to amaze me how little a step you need to take to find you've crossed a line. Sometimes it feels like millimeters. At times this line crosses sensibilities, in which case, oh well. And at times this line crosses societal values and freedoms, and then the artist must provide some sort of answer, or they may find their work impeded and or censored. And there are numerous kinds of cases, all various shades of complicated gray. I'm not an expert in this area, as I said. I'm sure we all remember a few years ago the Ontario College of Arts student who videotaped his killing and torturing of a cat as an artistic statement against meat eating. So in my opinion, since art is a reenactment of life, the actual killing and torturing of an animal was not necessary for the expression of the idea in an artistic format, even if the act's criminality was functioning as part of the art. Furthermore, killing and torturing an animal is a crime, and the crime trumps the offered artistic intention. So, of course, to skim the subject somewhat superficially due to the time, there are limits to artistic freedom, as there are with all human freedoms. But more often than not, the usual collision between the artist and society is between the artist's vision and society's understanding of what that perspective intends. Remember, a few years ago, there was an attempt to get Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird out of Nova Scotia schools because the N-word was used 48 times in the book. Those opposed saw having the book as part of the curriculum in and of itself a racist act, rather than, as perhaps the writer intended, an opportunity through a creative medium to examine long-held attitudes of racism in our society and what that says about us. So here is where the artist and society usually collide. On the one hand, you have the artist's intention to accurately portray life in the manner in which they see it, not always how they or others want it to be, and not always how it should be, although a piece can do that, but how the artist sees life as it is, in many cases, warts and all. And on the other hand, you have society's reaction based on a reluctance to look at what the artist has held up to the uncomfortable, glaring light, and also the misunderstanding that to portray something as it is seen is not necessarily a call to perpetuate it, but rather a challenge to examine what we accept or have accepted in the past to be true. Art, by its quest for artistic truth, which is its job, often opens up cans of worms for discussion, and we live in a world where the mere act of discussion is often seen as inappropriate, subversive, and dangerous. So should publicly funded art reflect an official understanding of local or national culture? Should it? No. Can it? Yes. That's up to whatever is decided between the individual artist and the funder. Again, artists are often caught in the divide between their job description and society's understanding of that job description. There's art, and then there's culture. Culture comes from art. Culture's lifeblood comes from the boundary-pushing and creative experimentation of art. It takes the raw extremes of what is happening in art and brings it to the middle for consumption. Therefore, to demand that art reflect the culture showcases a misunderstanding of the artist's job. Because art, whether good or bad, is a reflection of the artist's perspective, talent, and craft, it is therefore the artist's job to discover that vision and to remain true to that. But because the artist, although an outsider maybe, is also a member of their society, their art will naturally reflect aspects of the society they live in. And out of that art emerge collective themes that culture then takes and unifies the local or national society with. But to demand that the artist's work reflect a local or national culture is to put a restraint on the artist that impedes their job. It's putting the cart before the horse. And it can also put art in a place where it's expected to serve the agenda of different groups in society, including government. So what are the costs to the lack of artistic freedom? Well, one of the biggest social costs is less art and less good art. A highly effective way to impinge upon artistic freedom is to devalue art by severely limiting funding to artists. The social and cultural costs from inadequate funding are enormous. Now, the numbers I'm using here apply to this province, but the issue of inadequate funding applies across the country, provincially and nationally. According to Statistics Canada, Nova Scotia has dropped from 7th to 9th place for per capita government expenditure on culture. The average Nova Scotian earns around $26,000 a year. The poverty line for a single person is $18,000 a year. Average income for a Nova Scotia craftsperson is $12,000 a year, which means many artists long to be poverty line wealthy. This means the same artists that governments purport to love and foster, and whose talents are often shilled in tourism ads, can be and have been forced to drop out of the arts in order to live, which is a shame, because God knows what artistic contributions that would inform and refresh our culture we've lost. And so in terms of the question, what are the social costs to the lack of our artistic freedom, I would cite these lost contributions of artists who simply cannot sustain themselves to be a major loss to our society, our culture, and our identity. And as to what the benefits are, you only have to think of your favorite Canadian writer, painter, singer, dancer, and some form of an answer is summoned easily enough. Those are some of my thoughts. Thank you.